Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is What's Left. I'm your host. My name's Larry Erickson, and for the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about a couple of things. I hope you'll find them interesting enough to stay with us for that time. If you have any reactions to the show, as always, you can send them to me directly. This is my personal email here, whoviating@aol.com. And if you didn't catch that, you can always go to my website. It's called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. The URL will be around here a couple of times during the show. You can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather do that. Just two requests, as always, if you do send me email, one, include something in the subject line to make it clear this is about the show, it's not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer, but you will get one. All right, with that, let's get on with it. I always like to start with some good news, and so here's some. There's a lot of concern in the wake of the enormous protests that related to the Women's March in January, a protest which turned actually about 4 million people out into the streets across the country. There was concern that after that, the resistance would sort of just peter out. I even recall counseling folks at the time that the resistance, that level of intensity of resistance we'd just seen, it was unrealistic to expect that to continue, and that we should aim instead for a constant undercurrent of opposition, the sort of resistance that doesn't seek to flood the streets on a weekly basis, but can be carried on for an indefinite period of time, geared to ongoing long-term resistance. As it turns out, apparently, we needn't have worried. According to an ongoing series in the Washington Post based on figures from the Crowd Counting Consortium, there have been protests every single month in the U.S. There have been in various places around the country, and the totals involved in those months have been anywhere from tens of thousands to over 100,000. And June was the biggest month so far. The Washington Post counted 818 protests, demonstrations, strikes, marches, sit-ins, and rallies in the U.S. in June, with at least one in every state and the District of Columbia, and involving somewhere between 950,000 and 1.2 million people. And as the Post notes, and I can verify from personal experience, mainstream media often neglect to cover nonviolent demonstrations, especially small ones. So it's quite possible that list of actions is incomplete. And even within that list, sometimes the crowd, there's no estimate of the crowd size. So the figures of about 1 million people being involved is certainly an undercount. Now, it's true that the level of protests, to a fair extent, has been driven by the abnormally destructive policies of the administration of Donald the Rump. But he's actually just a focus. He's not the cause. To put it another way, he's the spark, but he's not the fire. As has been well noted by one writer, quoting, "Resistance isn't something invented on November 9th. America's history bristles with resistance. Every great reform was begun by resistors to the established order. Resistance has been a bit more prevalent recently than during some periods. Occupy, Black Lives Matter, the fight for LGBTQ equality and dignity, the reproductive rights struggle, climate hawks, and the rising up of indigenous people in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico against the relentless plunder of their land all have resistors at work who didn't start yesterday." Now, again, there's no good reason to expect that that level of protest seen in June will be maintained indefinitely. But that constant undercurrent, that constant flow of tens of thousands engaging in local action every month, that has been maintained, it can be maintained. And that definitely is good news. Which, unhappily, brings us right into one of our regular features. This is the outrage of the week. Our First Amendment rights, our rights to protest, our right to take part in actions such as these are under attack. As protests increased and continued, so did the efforts by others to shut them down entirely, or at least intimidate people from taking part in them. This spring, state legislative sessions have seen at least 30 bills introduced across 20 states to limit the right of public protest, to increase punishment for civil disobedience, or both, by measures such as, for example, banning the wearing of masks, by declaring some areas to be critical infrastructure forever off limits to any protest, or by changing, for example, a charge of sitting in a street and blocking traffic from a misdemeanor to a felony. In fact, bills in 2 states, South Dakota and Tennessee, even proposed to protect drivers who ran over demonstrators sitting in the street. The particular danger that we face these days seems to be, it lies in the use of mass arrests without probable cause. Back on October 1st, 2011, this is during the Occupy protests, 700 people were marching peacefully and, as far as they knew legally, across the Brooklyn Bridge in New York City. Police had closed the bridge to vehicular traffic, and the police began walking in the roadway. Now, the protesters, reasonably assuming that the police were trying to get this march across the bridge as efficiently as possible, followed them into the street, only to have the police stop the march, trap them from the back, and arrest all 700 people. Now, police claim they told the marchers to stay out of the roadway, but there was no way that anyone other than those in the very front of the march could have even heard them. And even assuming the police did make such an announcement, those further back could not possibly have known about it. No matter, it was a mass arrest, all guilty of blocking traffic, even though, again, there was no traffic to block. A suit arose, Garcia v. Bloomberg. The Supreme Court recently refused to hear the protest appeal of their loss at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. These courts have thus legitimized the idea of mass arrest without proper warning or without giving people an opportunity to disperse. It gets worse. On January 20th, Inauguration Day, police in Washington, D.C., by their own account, followed a group of a couple of hundred protesters for about a half an hour. During that time, there were a few people in the group who broke windows. Now, instead of going in and arresting the people they had probable cause to arrest because they saw them break a window, the police waited to a certain point, then trapped 200 of these demonstrators in police netting, sweeping up demonstrators, journalists who were covering the event, and even some passersby who just happened to be there at the moment. Again, it was a mass arrest without warning or an opportunity to disperse. Those people, all 214 of them, were charged with felony rioting that carries a penalty of up to 10 years in prison. In April, additional charges of property destruction, inciting or urging to riot, and conspiracy to riot, with penalties of up to 75 years in prison, were added. Now, while some of those arrested have cut plea bargains, many of the cases are still pending, including against at least one of these journalists. But here's the point. Here's the real point. To indict someone, to bring them to trial, it takes probable cause directed to that individual, not some unnamed someone. If these arrests are allowed to stand, it would mean that if you are at a demonstration, no matter how peaceful, no matter how legal, and someone in that group commits a crime, like, for example, breaking a window, that you and everyone else there could be arrested and charged with that same crime or conspiracy to commit that same crime, and there would be no need on the part of police or prosecutors to say that you did anything at all. Guilt, criminal guilt by association in its purest form. And no, I'm not exaggerating. The potential chilling effect of the right to protest is hard to measure. The potential chilling effect on the right of a free press to cover such events may be less immediately obvious, but it's just as serious. Because there's more. On July 25th, a group of about 95 disabled people disrupted the vote in the Senate to proceed with the debate on health care. The debate, as you know, got nowhere. But there's a motion to proceed, and these disabled people disrupted the vote by shouting, "Kill the bill, don't kill us," and "shame." Now, Capitol Police dragged them from the gallery because, the Senate is, after all, a First Amendment free zone. And then the thing is, after they dragged the people into the hallway, they blocked the media from covering the arrests. They demanded that there be no photographs, that there be no video, and ordering journalists to delete the photos or videos they had already taken. Why? Because, get this now, this is their excuse, it's a crime scene. And if that excuse makes you go, so what? It should. In the eyes of the Capitol Police, they have the power to say, you will not cover this protest. You will make no record of this protest. You will make no record of the protesters' arrest, which bluntly is just one short step away from being able to say, this event did not happen. Meanwhile, Jeff, I'm not a racist, really I'm not, Sessions, darkly intones about press subpoenas and about how press freedom is not unlimited. Well, actually, nobody ever said it was, although Thomas Jefferson said, and this actually is a real quote, not one of those phony quotes, a real quote, "Were it left for me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." The fact is, we are much more threatened by the power of the government to restrict and conceal than we are by the power of protesters in the press to resist and reveal. And as those threats to our right increase, as threats against the free press, as threats against the right to protest increase, so does the outrage. And we are taking a break. And here we are back. I'm going to spend the rest of the show on something I do every couple of years right around this time. Something that this year carries extra resonance as we now daily have the spectacle of two egomaniacal sociopathic man-babies spluttering threats at each other across the Pacific Ocean like it was some fourth grade schoolyard. Because what I'm going to address is the anniversary, the 72nd anniversary as it turns out, of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the birth of the age of nuclear weapons. Most people start the American nuclear arms effort to a famous 1939 letter written by Dr. Leo Szilard, a physicist named Leo Szilard, but was sent to President Roosevelt over the signature of Albert Einstein because they thought his name would be more impressive to Roosevelt's advisors. The letter noted the possibility of producing an atomic bomb. And by the time of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. already had a small project going that had made some actual progress. Now, the political argument given for building the atomic bomb, the investing enormous amounts of time, energy, money, resources, and scientific talent into what became known as the Manhattan Project, the reason was that some intelligence reports have said that Nazi Germany was working on such a bomb, and if they were going to have one, we had to have one. Now, although it must in fairness be noted that it may not have been known at the time, but the fact is that although the Germans were making some experiments in that direction, the way they were going about it was extremely inefficient, and it would have taken them decades to develop a bomb if in fact it was possible at all. Now, some of late have tried to resuscitate this claim of the Nazi bomb by claiming the Germans were closer than we knew. The argument, however, is based on the Germans' progress in enriching uranium and relies on the supposition that in the 1940s, these scientists working on that project could have suddenly changed gears and adopted a sharply different approach to building a bomb than they had before. That is to do exactly what they had decided not to do earlier, which would also, by the way, entail admitting to the superiors that they had wasted a lot of time and money on a dead end. At least one writer added the idea that there was a commando raid in Norway which destroyed an enrichment facility there, claiming that set back the German bomb project significantly. Now, that undoubtedly did slow production of enriched uranium, but it did not affect the problems with the bomb design itself. In other words, the argument that they were closer than we knew ultimately depends on a string of what-ifs, which makes for interesting speculation, but not a persuasive argument. All right, but the thing is, no matter what you think on that point, what's important here is that it was the claimed threat from Germany that supposedly provided the logic, the argument, the basis for the Manhattan Project. And yet, by late 1944, U.S. intelligence knew that the German nuclear experiments had failed. The Manhattan Project didn't even slow down. In fact, Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945, 10 weeks before the first successful test explosion of an atomic bomb. It was codenamed Trinity, and it took place at Alamogordo Testing Range, 230 miles south of Los Alamos, New Mexico, on July 16th, 1945. With the surrender of Germany, the entire founding logic of the Manhattan Project, the entire founding logic of building a nuclear bomb evaporated, vanished. But the project by then had become its own purpose, its own end. So instead of stopping or even slowing down, the project accelerated because at least some on the staff were afraid that the war would end before they were able to actually build a bomb. So we simply switched myths. From the myth of Nazi atomic bombs to the myth of the fanatical Japanese. The weapon that was supposedly designed for defense against Germany now had to be used on Japan. And here's what's probably the most important myth of all, because it provided the logical, if you can call it that, underpinnings for actually carrying out the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for actually vaporizing tens of thousands of people in the flash of an instant and opening the door to the atomic age. A myth that gets replayed, repronounced, reproduced, reproclaimed every time Hiroshima and Nagasaki get mentioned. It's a myth that people continue to believe to this day, as polls show that a majority of Americans approve of these bombs having been dropped. The myth that the Japanese were so fanatical that the only possible alternative to the devastation of the atomic bombs was a bloody land invasion of Japan. It's just not true. It's more than a myth, worse than a myth. It's a lie, a damned 70-year-old lie. To begin with, claims heard whenever the subject gets discussed that such an invasion would have cost 250,000 or 500,000 or 1 million American lives. The numbers vary rather unpredictably. It's utter nonsense. Even President Truman originally cited an estimate of 250,000 casualties, not deaths, casualties, although in later years he doubled that figure and doubled it again for no apparent reason on any occasion except possibly for self-justification. More to the point, the War Planning Committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff never expected more than 40,000 American deaths and actually suggested it could be as few as 20,000 because they thought it a fair likelihood that Japan would surrender during the opening weeks of such a campaign. Now, 20,000 is a lot of people. Then again, it is about 1/7 to 1/10 the amount of death that we inflicted on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which in turn raises the more important question of whether such an invasion was necessary at all. It wasn't. By the spring of 1945, Japan was already a defeated nation. It no longer had any navy to speak of. Its air force had been decimated, its army driven back to its own shores. It was incapable of mounting any offensive action or even defending itself against U.S. air raids. Critical materials and even food were in short supply. The situation was so bad that even attempts to justify the bombings wind up pointing out how bad the situation for Japan was. Several years ago, I had an email debate with a man who tried to defend the bombing by projecting the classic image of a Japan bristling with military forces. And at one point, trying to show the determination of the Japanese to defend the homeland at all cost, he said, and I'm quoting, "Japan pulled back some 500 loaded ships out of China and not one of them made it back to Japan because of attacks by high-altitude bombers." In response, I noted that he had thereby agreed, if unexpectedly, unintentionally, that Japan's air force was so thoroughly destroyed that it couldn't even provide cover for its own retreating forces. In fact, the situation was so bad that before the bombing of Hiroshima, Japan had already made secret overtures to the United States through Sweden and the Soviet Union offering to surrender. All of this is known to the U.S. military. All of this is known to Truman, who rejected the offer because it wasn't unconditional. It would mean that Hirohito would retain his role as emperor. What was also known to Truman, by the way, was the USSR's intent to declare war on Japan and its likely impact. In his journal about his meetings with Stalin at the Potsdam Conference, Truman wrote on July 17, 1945, that this is, by the way, was the day after, one day after the Trinity test, he'll be in Japan war on August 15th, Finny Japs when that comes about, quote unquote. By the way, Truman had stalled at the beginning of the conference because he wanted to know if the Trinity test was successful or not before he dealt with Stalin. The point is, the atomic bombings of Japan were simply unnecessary. But we refused to accept the idea, refused even to accept surrender, because by then peace was not enough, even victory was not enough. It had to be utter, smashing, devastating, total victory. So it was that early in the morning of August 6, 1945, the B-29 Superfortress bomber nicknamed Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island in the Pacific, headed for Hiroshima, a Japanese city of about 250,000 people. It carried a single bomb, codenamed Little Boy. At 8:15 a.m. local time, Little Boy was dropped. Now, I want to pause for a moment here to give you a sense of the kind of power that is being unleashed here. The bomb contained 64 kilograms, about 141 pounds of highly enriched uranium. Of that amount, only about 7/10 of a kilogram, about 1.5 pounds, actually fissioned. That is, the atoms actually split apart. And only about 600 milligrams was actually converted into energy. 600 milligrams is about 6/10 of a gram. That's about 1/50th of an ounce. The energy released by that 1/50th of an ounce had the explosive force of 14,000 tons of dynamite. It was enough to devastate Hiroshima. Around 70,000 people died, some of them literally vaporized. Another 20,000 died shortly thereafter, some thousands more by 1950 of injuries, radiation poisoning, and cancer. 3 days later, another nuclear bomb, codenamed Fat Man, did the same to Nagasaki, with tens of thousands more dead, thousands more condemned to die of injuries, radiation poisoning, and cancer, and another city destroyed. So we destroyed Hiroshima and we destroyed Nagasaki when the Japanese didn't surrender fast enough. We destroyed them even though many U.S. officials and top military officers, including such as Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair Admiral William Leahy, and people like Generals Dwight Eisenhower, Hap Arnold, and Douglas MacArthur, all said this was unnecessary. And that judgment actually proved correct by U.S. analysts sent to Japan in 1946, who concluded that Japan would have surrendered by November 1st, 1945, quoting, "Even if atomic bombs hadn't been dropped, Russia hadn't entered the war and no invasion was planned," unquote. Bombing Hiroshima was necessary, and the U.S. government and military knew it was unnecessary. It was a crime, a war crime, one that we compounded, more than doubled, by bombing Nagasaki before the impact of the first bomb had a chance to settle in. And the thing is, Nagasaki wasn't even the primary target. Kokura was. In fact, Nagasaki wasn't even on the original list of the top 3 targets for the second bomb, and wound up being devastated only because Kokura had too much cloud cover that day for a clean bomb run. That second bombing was originally scheduled for August 20th. It was moved up to August 11th when fissionable material became available sooner than expected. It was then pushed forward to August 9th by a day and night effort to order get in the next attack ahead of several days of bad weather predicted for Japan. General Leslie Groves, the director of the Manhattan Project, claimed that speed was the only consideration. Quoting him, "Admiral Purnell and I had often discussed the importance of having the second blow follow the first one quickly so the Japanese would not have time to recover their balance." Now, the statement seems a little forced, but take Groves at his word. It is then legitimate to ask if the purpose was to stun the Japanese into surrender or to get in the second bombing before it had a chance to. There is good reason to think the latter. Truman's note about Finny Japs when the Soviets entered the war against Japan was not enthusiasm. It was a reflection of concern about Soviet influence in the post-war world. Before the bombing, some officials suggested we stage a demonstration blast on a deserted island to show the Japanese the power of the weapon we had before we actually used it. Among those proposing such an idea, by the way, was Leo Szilard, who apparently, having some regret about his role in starting this whole thing, pleaded with Secretary of State James Burns not to use the bomb on people and circulated a petition to Truman to rule out the use because it would, quote, open the door to an era of devastation on an unimaginable scale. The idea of the demonstration blast was supposedly shelved, but in fact, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were demonstration blasts. They were intended to show the awesome power we held in our arsenal, only the target of the demonstration wasn't Japan, it was the Soviet Union. U.S. officials, including Secretary of State James Burns, Presidential Advisor Bernard Baruch, and top military leaders had urged the use of atomic weapons on Japan as a means of warning the Soviet Union not to challenge U.S. plans for a post-war world shaped to serve U.S. interests, to, in Burns' words, allow the U.S. to dictate our own terms with the USSR at the end of the war and make Russia more manageable in Europe by demonstrating the power of our arsenal and our willingness to use it. Which means ultimately that hundreds of thousands of Japanese were destroyed, disintegrated as sacrificial lambs at the start of a decades-long campaign to contain the Soviet Union. From Nazi bomb scientists through wild-eyed Japanese fanatics to intractable Soviet deceivers, the myth-makers had constructed an image of the United States as appointed to protect and shape the world with the atomic bomb, as President Truman put it, the weapon given us by God that we were to use for his purposes and his ends. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not the last shots of World War II. They were the first shots of the Cold War, and the Japanese its first victims. Now, on another note here, some are claiming that atomic bombings had nothing to do with Japan's surrender, that in fact it was, as one writer put it, Stalin, not Truman, who ended the war. The argument's largely based on a time frame. The fact is that despite the dire situation, the Japanese High Command had never considered unconditional surrender until the morning of August 9th, before Nagasaki, and nearly 3 full days since Hiroshima, but just hours after learning of the Soviet declaration of war. Now, certainly Russia's entry into the war had a large impact, because even if it took no military action, it would no longer be able to act as a mediator for a peace settlement. So that would have an effect there, even if it did nothing militarily. However, the argument that the nuclear attacks were inconsequential in Japan's surrender is belied by several facts. At that very August 9th meeting, the Soviet declaration and the bombing of Hiroshima were presented as twin reasons for why the war could not continue. And a few hours later, it was clear that the claim by some that nuclear weapons are so complicated the U.S. could only have one was proved to be false. And more importantly, when Japan did surrender on August 15th, in his address to the nation, Hirohito specifically referenced the use of, quote, a new and most cruel bomb, unquote, as a cause for surrender. Now, it's obviously historically wrong to say the Soviet declaration of war was a sideshow of little importance in ending the war, but to say that it is what made all the difference is simply to switch one myth for another. As a final note here, the ultimate terms of surrender for Japan were very much like those offered by Japan before the bombings of Hiroshima, including allowing Hirohito to remain on as emperor, which clearly marks the last several weeks of World War II. Whatever else you think about the bombings and everything with the Soviets, everything about anything, the last several weeks of World War II were a complete and utter waste, even in the narrowest military sense, a complete and utter waste of time, energy, resources, and most importantly, life. And that, too, is part of the world the Manhattan Project created. All right, that's it for this week. We are actually taking a vacation. We're going to be gone for a few weeks now. So the first week in September is when we'll be back. We're going to take a great American road trip. So we're going to have a great time. And in the meantime, though, you have the best rest of these few weeks that you possibly can. Enjoy your August. And for now, as always, peace.